This is an audio course. Thank you for listening.
You say that we're losing our listening. What's that about?
Well, technology is a big part of that. You know, when you are going to listen to somebody, Scott Peck said you cannot truly listen to another human being and do anything else at the same time. And yet, most of the time, we're doing four things at once, you know. And particularly, I know younger people are getting really almost addicted to multi-stream input. You know, if you're just watching a film, that's boring. You need to be commenting about it on a blog or some sort of a website, as well as doing something else, you know, talking to a friend and so on and so forth. So this fast switching attention, seeking stimulation, I think is a big part of why we don't listen so much. And the other element in it, I guess, is simply that noise is around us a lot in urban situations, and we get deadened, we get numbed. Our listening simply becomes less sensitive. We get used to discounting sound. Most of it's nasty. So why would you want to listen to it? And that becomes a habit, because listening is a skill, you know. It's a skill that we can develop, and it's a very important skill for living effectively and for being happy, and also for being well. I mean, it's part of being well is listening to the sound around you and taking responsibility for what you consume through your ears. And there's an awful lot of people who are doing themselves an awful lot of damage by consuming unpleasant noise or loud sound, damaging their hearing, creating stress reactions. I'll give you one example of that. And not all of this is intentional, by the way. The average noise level in German classrooms these days is around 65 decibels, according to studies in Germany. And that's not surprising because of group work. You know, this is where all the kids are chattering at once, working in small groups. Teachers have to shout to get over 65 decibels. So not only did one British teacher have a successful suit for losing her voice entirely in that kind of situation, but also the research shows that 65 decibels is the level at which your risk of heart attack is significantly elevated if you're chronically exposed. Now, teachers are chronically exposed. They work every day in that situation. So it's very likely that teachers are shortening their lives by working in that situation day after day. And yet we don't pay attention to it. You know, it's not ear damaging, 65 decibels, but it's definitely bad for your health. And that's happening all over the place. Traffic noise is blighting the lives of millions of people across the world who can't sleep at night. And sleep deprivation is a terrible thing, long term. But unfortunately, there are no votes in noise. You know, you don't see a politician standing up and saying, vote for me, I'll make it quieter. Can I speak for a moment about the circular relationship between speaking and listening? Because that's really important.
Oh, sure.
I mean, I think it's quite interesting. My TED Talk on speaking has been seen by about 6 times as many people as my TED Talk on listening. And that says something about our priorities. We're much keener to be heard than to listen in general. And so it's really important that people understand if you want to be heard, it is crucial to be a good listener. It's much, much easier to speak to somebody you understand and to speak to somebody that you've got some sort of rapport with than to be missing the mark completely because you're misinterpreting the person. You don't care, you don't know, who are they? You're likely to miss the target entirely. There's this circular relationship. The way I speak affects the way you listen. The way you listen affects the way I speak. And the way I speak affects the way you speak. And the way I listen affects the way you listen. So it's dynamic. It's going all the time between two people talking, or one person talking to a group, or one person on a stage talking to hundreds. Doesn't matter. There's this circle going all the time. And that's why really it's the central thesis of the book and the course, that in order to be a great, powerful speaker, if you want to be effective, if you want to build team, if you want to inspire, motivate, lead, any of those things, or even just have a happy family life and be heard in life, you need to be listening as well. You can't do it if you're not listening. And listening is a skill.
Well, yeah, that's good. For the 6 times as many people who are interested in being heard, here's your why. To listen. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I don't care about listening. I want to speak. I want people to listen to me, Well, they will if you listen to them. There's a question that I suggest. It's a really core question in the book and in the course, is the question, what's the listening I'm speaking into? That is such an important question. Because listening changes from person to person. It changes over time as well for one person. Our listening changes after lunch. You're a bit sleepy, or it changes if you've just had brilliant news or if you've just had terrible news. Emotions affect all of the filters we develop through life: values, attitudes, beliefs, intentions, expectations, assumptions about what people think of us, the language you speak, the culture we're born into. All these things affect our listening. That means every human being's listening is unique. So it is really important not to assume everybody listens like I do, which is a very common mistake, and to ask the question, what's the listening I'm speaking into? That is a great exercise if you want to become a powerful speaker, and if you want to develop relationships with people and work on your listening. It makes listening fascinating because you're listening to the listening. You're observing the person that you're speaking to with your eyes, with every sense that you've got, and you simply have to ask the question, what's the listening? And I promise everybody listening to this, by getting into the habit of asking that question, you will naturally generate the sensitivity. It doesn't require a course or a degree or anything like that. It's natural.
And we say, what's the listening? You've got a number of categories.
Well, yes, there are many ways to listen, and it's simple things. If you're talking to somebody who's very slow, then you can slow down. Now, to some degree, people with empathy will do that naturally, but there are an awful lot of people who have never generated much empathy and who will rattle away at their own natural pace, regardless of the person they're speaking to, whether they're faster, slower, whether they have a particular listening style. They're particularly warm and emotive. They want to, or they're somebody who just wants to give me the summary. I'm not interested in all that stuff. Or somebody who wants the facts and figures. There are variations. That one's called think, feel, know. 3 classes of people. There are lots of ways of cutting people up like that, dividing people into groups. The important thing is to look at the person in front of you and to understand them. Listen to the listening. Ask yourself the question, because naturally you'll start to adapt your style. So if it's a slow person, you can simply slow down a little bit and be a little bit calmer. Or if it's a really fast person, you can start to speed up and you can become more energetic and so forth. That is fundamental. So that's one exercise I do recommend to everybody. It'll improve your speaking and your listening skills.
And so you've got a number of exercises you recommend to help improve conscious listening. Can you share a couple of those that are the most helpful for folks?
Silence. A few minutes of silence every day. That's a really good thing to do. Silence is the baseline, and it's quite rare in urban situations now that we get any silence at all. I'd be happy to define silence as absence of human noise. A bird song, running water, wind in leaves, those are pretty acceptable departures from absolute silence. It's rare that we will get absolute silence anyway. And if you can't get it, anything approximating to it, just a quiet room, that'll be fine, even if there's a little background hum of some kind. Just sitting with yourself, recalibrating your ears, because silence is the baseline. Silence is the base for all sound. It's what makes sound meaningful, after all. And the same thing for music, of course, with no gaps. It's simply cacophony. So silence is very important. And if you can re-establish your relationship with silence, it will make your listening more acute. And also, every time you encounter it, it kind of recalibrates your ears, like a sorbet in a meal, it resets you and it allows you to listen again afresh. Any recording engineer will tell you that they have to stop every hour or so, go and sit somewhere quiet, because otherwise they go deaf really to the mix. They can't hear it anymore. Another great exercise is rasa. Apart from being the Sanskrit word for juice, that stands for receive, appreciate, summarize, ask. So receive is actually facing the person and looking at them. You know, it's amazing how much partial listening we do in the world. I am listening to you. No, you're typing away on a mobile. You're doing a text. That's not listening. That's doing a text. So doing nothing else, it's a great gift to give somebody, to give them 100% of your attention, to just lay everything else down, stop and try it. And honestly, I recommend anybody listening to this, after you've heard this podcast, go and try this at home. You know, when you get home, actually listen to the people in your family or to the first people you come across, your friends or whoever it is. And you'll probably find their reaction will be something like, "What are you doing?" Because they're not used to it at all. They're used to you being half out of the room or doing something else or tapping away on something. And they're getting, you know, the scrag end of your attention, as we would say in the UK. So it's a wonderful gift. I reckon there are billions of people on this planet who've never been properly listened to in that way. So that's receive. Face them, lean forward, eyes on them, doing nothing else. Appreciate is the little noises and gestures that we make to show that we're with them in the conversation. So it's, oh, really? Which, you know, you're not doing at the moment because we're on a kind of radio style conversation, and it's a bit disconcerting for the listeners.
Oh, I was just tweeting. Sorry, Julian.
As you do with, yes, I'm watching the football here at the same time. So, you know, radio's got its own rules, or podcasting has got its own rules for this. But in a normal conversation, you'd be doing that, I'd be doing that. And it's, if you're face to face, gestures too, little raised eyebrows, smiles, nods, bobs of the head, you know, that kind of thing that mirroring gestures, we do that naturally if we're really engaged. The S is summarize, and that is very, very important too. The word so. So allows you to close doors in the corridor of your conversation. So what I've understood you to say is this. Is that correct? Yep. Okay, now we move on to that. Or if you're in a meeting, so what we've all agreed now is this. Let's move on to topic 2. If you haven't got a so person in a meeting, it can be a very, very long meeting indeed, going round in circles. And then the A is ask. Ask questions all the way through, at the beginning, at the end. Open-ended questions are good. Why, what, where, when, how, who, because they preclude the answer yes or no, and they get more information. Questions show you're interested, and they allow you also to make the conversation interesting for you, because you can start to help direct it in the directions you find most stimulating. So that's really interesting. Tell me more about this. Is a way of moving the conversation into the areas you find most interesting, profitable, useful, fascinating, stimulating, whatever it may be. So that's rasa, very useful exercise in conversation. I would like to form a society for the preservation of the word so, which is becoming entirely abused, I'm sad to say. You know, I'll say to people, what's your name? So, I'm John. I'm sorry, you're John because I just asked you? So has a logical flow. This, so, that. It's the same as then or thus or therefore. And in conversation, it's a really, really powerful word. I've even seen people walk onto the TED stage and start a talk with the word so. What? So what? Hang on. There's no point of reference here. It's becoming debased by being deployed in that way, I think. But it's really powerful. It's a little word, but it's a very important little word. I talk about words to avoid in speaking. And one
Let's
of
grab
those,
a few of those. Yeah.
yeah, okay, we could have fun with that. I was just going to say one of those that's like bindweed, because the moment you start using it, it will crop up all over the place. Very hard to eliminate. The word just. Now, as an adjective, that's terrific. You know, he's a just man, just meaning fair and so forth. That's a lovely word. But as an adverb or a modifier, particularly as a minimizer, it's a pernicious little word that will creep in all over the place. You know, he's just a child. Well, okay, that's somewhat patronizing, but it's when we use it to minimize our own. I'll just have one. Has anybody ever just had one and regretted it?
Or a lot of emails that are just following up.
Yes, just following up. It's an excuse, and I do this on stage a lot. So I come on and I say, I'd just like to start with some housekeeping announcements. And then I go back and redo the thing and come on and say, I'd like to start with some housekeeping announcements. Now, which one of those is most powerful? It's the second one, isn't it?
Definitely, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because the first one, the just, is saying, sorry, do you mind if it's an apology. It's a kind of Weasley apology, minimizing the effect. So when you send an email saying just following up, it's a kind of apology. Sorry to bother you. I'm just following up. That's all I'm doing. It's just a little tiny thing, you know. And I think that word is one to be aware of. I'm not saying never use it, but I am saying you might have a little alarm bell ringing when you use it and say, would it be more powerful to delete? I nearly said just to delete that. So that's where it starts to get in. The other word that I really recommend banning altogether from vocabulary is the word should. I cannot think of a single profitable use of that word. If we use it to other people, it's judgmental. You should really lose some weight. Ouch. Or if we're using it on ourselves, it's self-recriminatory and it's kind of wallowing in guilt. I should have done that. I should have, you know, there's no good outcome from that particular word. I will, that's a different thing. I've learned the lesson. I did this. I will in future do that. Should, I can't see the use of it personally. So I banned it from my vocabulary quite a long time ago, and I've been happier since, I think.
What are your top pieces of wisdom that you think folks really need to absorb when it comes to speaking such that they're heard after they've done their listening?
There is content and there is delivery, and they're both important. Actually, for the book, I interviewed Chris Anderson, the head of TED, and asked him that question, which is the most important, Chris? And he said, well, they're both important, but if forced to choose, I would go for content, because I will sit and stay with somebody who's delivering earth-shattering content in a pretty boring way. However, if somebody is delivering vapid nonsense brilliantly, it's just irritating, isn't it? So content is very important. If you want to be heard, then getting your content right is crucial. And that again comes back, if you ask me, to asking the question, what's the listening? I mean, it's a question I ask myself before I'll do any talk to a group of people or, you know, even thousands of people. What's the listening I'll be speaking into? Are they going to want facts and figures? Are they going to want to hear about all aspects of sound, speaking, listening, or is it a particular aspect which is going to touch their lives? What are their problems? What are the things I can give them which will give them value in their lives? Asking yourselves those questions is really important, so that you start, or automatically you start to have a sensitivity for what, of all the things you could talk about, which ones are going to be valuable to that person. And that's another part of the secret here, isn't it? It's not about you. It's about them. Any speaker who goes on stage and it's all about me, that's not going to work too well. There are two particular addictions I think we have as a society now, which get in the way of designing good content. And those are looking good. We all like to look good, but if it becomes what you're about, that really doesn't fly very well in any conversation, and particularly not on stage. And the other one is, if there's one thing we like more than looking good, it's being right. Now, if you get into being right, that makes you very hard to listen to, I think. It's like a hole in the bucket. And the easiest way to be right, of course, is to make somebody else wrong. Hence, we have this kind of addiction to outrage going with the media. We have polarization in politics. We have the politics of shouting. It's not the politics of listening, is it? It's insults. It's demonization. It's caricaturing. And that is a slippery slope. That's a long, slippery slope down to some pretty unpleasant stuff, because listening is the doorway to understanding. And if we don't understand, if we're not interested in understanding people or listening to people we disagree with, then civil society kind of breaks down. I gave a TEDx talk in the Houses of Parliament and again in Athens, the cradle of democracy, arguing that listening actually is the sound of democracy, because without it, democracy will not work. We have to have civilized disagreement. And it's impossible to have that if you're in the business of, if you disagree, I'm going to shout you down. I think it's very important to consider the other person in conversation. And that really will help to shape what we're saying. The content will be much more accurate. I think it was Barack Obama who said, I like to listen to people, especially when I disagree with them. And listening is a very good way of refining your content as well, dynamically, I'm talking about. So you might start a conversation with an agenda, with some things you believe are going to be valuable or interesting to talk about, having thought about the person you're speaking to, and then it'll get reformatted as the dynamic conversation takes place. Well, if you're not listening to them, they won't listen much to you. Whereas if you listen carefully to them, ask them questions, people love talking about themselves. You know, for anybody who's listening to this who says, nobody ever listens to me, try listening to them. Become a great listener. Ask them questions, little questions. Really? Tell me more. That is a gold dust phrase. Tell me more about that. Because it draws people out. It shows you're interested in them. It creates a kind of dynamic of interest, which will then reflect back and they'll start asking you questions and you can speak. So that's the way it goes. Listening and speaking always in this dance. And of course, content is only part of the story, because there's also how you say it. There's what you say and how you say it. And it is unfortunate for some people that they have challenges to overcome with their voice. I mean, we're all born with this amazing instrument, the human voice. It is an incredible instrument. Most people, in my experience, are only exploring a small fraction of the capability and power of their voice. So there's the vocal toolbox that I went through in, I think it was 12 minutes in the TED Talk on speaking. And the vocal toolbox is something that most people don't even know they have. You know, you can rummage around in there and you can play with things like pitch, pace, prosody or prosody, silence, gaps, volume level, where you can get really loud or you can whisper to make a point. So, you know, the dynamics of conversation are really, really important. One of the most significant things is varying. So if you have a voice that does this, every time you speak, you have this cadence. Pretty soon you're going to get people going to sleep because they've heard everything that you've said in the same way over and over again. You know, it's like a hypnotic thing. You put people into a sort of trance by repetitive cadences. So it's very important to vary your pace, your tone and pitch, not so much your timbre probably, although you can do that too. Use silence, leave gaps. On stage, I won't do it now because this is, again, podcast/radio, and if you leave dead air, people get very disconcerted. But on stage, I demonstrate this. You know, I can go quiet for the longest time. I'm talking about 30, 45 seconds. That's a long time on stage. And everybody just sits there, you know. The big fear most people have about public speaking is drying up. Well, you can take a long time to think. You do not have to fill in conversation or in a presentation or a talk. You don't have to fill every second with babble, with ums and ahs. And it makes it actually difficult to understand if you're always on. You need the light and shade, the valleys, to create the mountains. And that's a big part of delivering interesting content.
Can we hear a little bit about the other tools here and how we might think about that?
Absolutely. Well, there are 4 registers actually of the human voice, and 2 of them are very rarely used, and I wouldn't recommend people using them. There's one I can't do at all, which is called whistle register. It's very, very, very high up. It's like an ultra soprano. So I wouldn't even try that. The next one down is falsetto register, and that will be familiar to anybody who likes Monty Python, or anybody who likes a great deal of pop music. So Monty Python style, yes, exactly. Monty Python style is, he's a very naughty boy. It's not the most powerful way to speak. It's very acceptable as a powerful singing style. But if I walk on stage, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, lovely to be here. It's a little bit soft, ineffectual, and deferential, and also comical. So I wouldn't recommend speaking there very much. The next one down is the one we use most of the time. It's the modal register. And that ranges all the way from your nose right down to your chest. Now, of course, your voice comes from your vocal cords, which are in your throat, but you can resonate in different places by focusing on that. So, for example, if I go up into my nose here, you can hear the difference. And if I'm in my throat, this is a throat voice, which is a little bit light and what most people do most of the time. And then if I move down into my chest voice, you can immediately hear the bass coming because I'm resonating with my whole chest. That's a really big space. Now, you can practice moving your voice around by placing your hand on your chest or your throat or your nose and trying to feel the vibration. I do recommend working on the chest voice because deeper generally means more significant in terms of voices. We vote for politicians with deeper voices, other things being equal. Margaret Thatcher, the former British Prime Minister, had vocal coaching to lower her voice by a couple of tones because she felt that the higher female voice was being taken less seriously in the House of Commons. So it's a pretty good idea if you want to be taken seriously to be speaking down here instead of speaking up here. It's a simple thing and it can be practiced by anybody. Put your hand on your sternum, that bone in your chest, and practice resonating so you can start to feel the vibrations with your fingers. And that's a really good way of moving your voice down there. The final register is vocal fry. And unfortunately, it's become pretty common. Vocal fry sounds like this. You know, it's a very lazy way of speaking. I'm really excited about this. I don't think so. It sounds kind of lazy, cool, insouciant, but also disengaged, pretty ugly. It's not very good for your voice. And if you want to speak powerfully, I do advise get out of there as quickly as possible, back into the modal register, get that chest voice going. I mean, it's a shame to hear people speaking like this because your voice is so powerful and so amazing and it can do so many things. So that's a little piece on registers, and quite useful to be conscious of these and to start taking control instead of letting it just be what you have habitually done your whole life. Then prosody or prosody. Well, that's the sing-song of speech. That's the way we vary our tone and our pace in order to be understood. So it's completely different to speak in this quite lively, passionate way as opposed to speaking entirely on one note and at one pace without any prosody at all. I don't think anybody would find this very interesting for very long. It's robotic, isn't it? It's boring. The word monotonous comes from monotone. One tone is speaking on one note. So we want to avoid that. Now, some people have very restricted prosody. Unfortunately, it's the way they've learned to speak or it's something natural. Again, you can work on that. And there are exercises in the book and in the course, particularly, there are exercises which help to boost the range. I mean, that's what to do. It's like doing anything in a gym. You know, you work in a gym to build muscle. You might not need it all the time, but you give yourself more range. And it's the same thing with prosody. You can do exercises to increase your range and become more able to express yourself in a fascinating way. You know, you may not want to exaggerate it. You might not want to go completely like this. Nevertheless, it's good to have the range because you can then be conscious about how you deploy it. And again, there's culture here. Some cultures, you know, Italians, very like, you know, again, Latin countries tend to be more expressive. Scandinavian countries tend to be a little bit more like this. Yes, we are wildly excited about this. You know, and you just have to know, again, it's part of what's the listening I'm speaking into, to adapt to the listening of the people you're talking to.
All right. And timbre.
Well, timbre is the feel of a voice. It's tasting the voice just like you would taste a hot chocolate. And the words to describe voices that we tend to like are similar, actually, to the words you would use to describe a hot chocolate. Rich, dark, warm, sweet, smooth, those kind of words. If that's not you, don't panic, because timbre can be adjusted a great deal. If you have a little squeaky voice or something like that, go and see a coach. They'll give you the power to project, the understanding of breath and how to use it effectively, how to use your diaphragm effectively, posture, which is a huge part of the problem for a lot of people who are kind of slumped over or stretching or compressing their vocal cords. You know, I'm sitting at a desk speaking into a microphone. If I sit like most people do when they're having conversations, leaning forward like this, you can hear the effect on my voice because I'm stretching my vocal cords and it's not going to be me at my best. I can't get into my chest voice from here. On the other hand, if I put my head right back into my shoulders, I'm compressing my vocal cords and it sounds like this. So having your vocal cords vertical and having good posture is a very important part of speaking powerfully, of freeing your voice to do its best and of looking like you are confident. Again, if you're doing, you know, the Amy Cuddy TED talk about power poses, anything that makes you bigger boosts your testosterone, makes you look bigger. If you're one of those people whose whole gesture template is about making yourself smaller, gestures where you're crouched or hunched or folded or whatever it may be, again, that's going to affect the way people receive you because they can see that you don't feel confident. So there are things to practice here. A vocal coach or a drama coach can certainly help with any of those.
Well, Julian, anything else you want to make sure to mention?
Interrupting has become an absolute epidemic. I came across a horrifying stat the other day. In your country, in America, do you know the average length of time that you or I get to speak when we go and see our doctor before we get interrupted? This is our opening. So what's wrong with me, doctor, is how long do you think they give us?
Oh, I don't know. Maybe 15 seconds.
Yeah, well, you're not far off, actually. It's 18 seconds is the average 18 seconds. So some are shorter than that. How you can get an idea of what's wrong with somebody in 9 seconds or 7 seconds, I have no idea. I've barely been able to say my name in that time. So I think it's a pandemic, this interrupting, impatience. We need patience to listen. There are 4 C's I talk about in the book and the course for good listening, which are consciousness, that is to say, being aware you're doing something. It's not like hearing. Hearing is a natural capability. Listening is a skill. You're practicing a skill. The second C is compassion. It is really important to be compassionate, to seek to understand the other person. If that's where you're coming from, you can listen really, really well. The third C is commitment. And because you have to stop doing other things in order to listen well. And that does take commitment. And I would always recommend, again, if you want to be heard, it's worth making a little contract in a conversation. As in, do you have 5 minutes because I'd really like to speak to you. And if they say yes, you have that contract for 5 minutes. If you pile in and you haven't asked their permission, you may well be pushing water uphill here, or, working into the wind. It could be they've got other things going on you don't know about, and you're rudely interrupting whatever they're doing. And the final C, which is possibly the most important one, is curiosity, ferocious curiosity to learn something. I might learn something here. Where are they coming from? I think that is absolute rubbish, but how on earth is it they thought that? Why do they have that point of view? That kind of dialogue in your head makes you a much better listener. So the 4 C's of good listening, and I do encourage everybody to pay attention to their listening.